Santiniketan, West Bengal. Our organization supports students of lower strata of our society by providing them with free education, scholarships, and employment opportunities. In this very difficult time of a pandemic having taken over the world, the mode of learning has switched to online. Keeping that in mind, we have been actively organizing webinars focusing on art and culture, where we invite scholars and artists to speak about their individual interests in art. But today is a special day. Today we have with us Dr. Sudhir Patwardhan, an eminent artist of our country whose paintings of transitioning suburbs and hustling figures of Mumbai have been an inspiration to a lot many of us. Dr. Sudhir Patwardhan is a self-taught artist who lives in Mumbai and has participated in various international exhibitions and has numerous solo shows to his credit. His dignified oeuvre has been extensively written about, including monographs on his work called The Complicit Observer and The Crafting of Reality, Sudhir Patwardhan's Drawings by contemporary Indian art critic Mr. Renditions. Patwardhan sir has also curated exhibitions of Indian contemporary art, particularly Expanding Horizons, an exhibition which travelled around Maharashtra, and exhibitions in Guild Art Gallery Mumbai and Sudarshan Art Gallery Pune. To be honest, I can go on and on about Sudhir sir, but I think it is better that we listen to him as he speaks himself and takes us through his collected works and explains to us through his thought process behind the painterly universe he has created about a city that literally never sleeps. If the audience has any questions during the course of the presentation, please put your questions in the chat box. We will be taking it at the end of the presentation. And Sudhir sir, I request you to please take over the webinar now. Thank you. I'll be sharing the screen. I'm just switching off my video on microphone now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunjan. And thank you, Vinod, and thank you everyone associated with the Sendas Arts Trust. I'm very honored to have been invited to speak to all of you artists and friends. I'm going to be showing you a large number of slides because I decided that I would cover my journey right from the beginning in the 70s up to now, rather than show you any particular period as such. So what I'll do is, as I go along showing you the slides, I will try and highlight some of the basic themes that have been a part of my journey. The human figure, of course, has been at the center of my interests. And by human figure, I mean not just the form of the human figure, but people's lives. People's lives have been central to my concerns. Then the city life, because I've been an urban person, I've been living in Bombay for 50 years. So basically city life has impressed me, and I have been inspired by city life, and that has been a major concern. Then there is also the personal life, family life. These elements are also in my art. They come up at various points, and especially in the last 10-15 years, they have been more prominent. And lastly, the major kind of theme or major concern in my art is actually art itself, which means I am basically what you might call a realist painter. But what does realism mean? What is represent artist's work? His ideas of creativity, how all these affect his journey. So these are the basic themes through which I would like to take you as I go along showing you the slides. The slides are arranged more or less chronologically, but not absolutely chronology. There will be some to and fro movement, but basically they are starting with the earliest slides, so earliest paintings, coming down to the latest. So this is these two are very early works from the 70s, when I just moved to Bombay. And I think all young artists feel the need to give expression to their feelings, their own feelings. An artist feels that his feelings are very important, and that is the basis of any creativity. So it's at that age, this is common, and with me also, this aspect brought to the fore a kind of expressionist handling where the artist's feelings are paramount. Next, please. As you see with the image on the left, it's a continuation of that kind of feeling where basically the artist is expressing his own anguish, his own anger, his own frustration, whatever. At that particular point in 75, around 1975, I found another avenue in a sense. I used to travel a lot in the local trains in Bombay, and I kind of was looking at people sitting in front of me who are usually working class figures, lower middle class figures, so going up and down to work. So these were the people I was encountering sitting in front of me. So that figure of another person became my focus, and I started to then, in a sense, project my feelings into the other figure, but also in that process trying to understand his life rather than talking about my life, where they are individual, like a single figure is in the frame. A single figure is the focus of, and the background is more or less abstracted, simple, and the figure is the center of attention. And it's in some state of, let's say, pain, anguish, or even not necessarily, but doing some work. Next, please. Most of figures are male, but there are a few women figures also at that period. The inspiration for this came from these two forces, these kinds of figures took shape. Next, please. A natural movement in this was, as I was looking at other people, I was looking at their lives, I also started to notice, and I also started to take account of their surroundings. So this is a painting from 77, Irani restaurant. So where I would encounter these figures, the surroundings that were part of their life also started to become part of the composition. So the composition that earlier where only the central figure was of importance, it started to include other things of the city, which were characteristic of the city. And that continued in the next few years. Next, please. So here you can see that the overall composition becomes much more complex. Now here, moving away from a single figure, I introduce a play between multiple figures. And the multiple figures bring with them the space that they are occupying. So it also becomes an interaction between different spaces. So here you see the central figure sitting and drinking his tea. Then there are two pairs of legs on the right side, which is another level in the restaurant, in the cafe, the street side cafe where someone is sitting. Then there is the element on the right and the left side where outside the cafe a bus is passing, someone is standing. So these multiple, so it more or less moved towards a kind of narrative. So here with multiple figures, they may be interacting with each other, they may not be interacting with each other, but they are part of one space which is not a neutral space. Where the space itself is, in a sense, bending towards each one's needs. The space is coming in contact with each other. Something like that. This painting is from 79 called City. Next, please. Here what I was saying about the bending of space is more apparent. So here you have the compartment of the local train broken into three as such. by these two columns, and you see some interaction between the figures, the person on the platform looking at a woman, another person inside the carriage looking at a woman. So these kinds of interactions happening within that. So it was a kind of building up towards a kind of narrative work. The important thing here is of the structure. Next, please. I'm showing you a fun and leisure painting called The City, which was painted in 1990. Fun and leisure has been a great influence on me. Not stylistically, I would say, because of course there are some paintings that I've painted that come close to his style also, but mainly to do with the way in which space is organized, structure. So in this image of the city, the modern city, where you encounter space divided by multiple columns, buildings, staircases, barristers. So all these elements become part of a composition where figures then become just elements in that composition. So this kind of a composition was, and as I showed you earlier in the train, that kind of division of space comes from my inspiration from leisure. Next, please. This is a painting called Accident on May Day. So this was painted in 81 and it's a day of workers' unity, but there has been an accident and the train has been stopped because someone has been killed under the tracks. Here again, I would draw your attention to the way in which the structure works. Another part of this, I became conscious of this sometime around this time, is that there were three elements that were important, within a painting for me. One was, of course, expression in the sense of my feeling, how I was responding to my surroundings, and I wanted to express that. So that was a kind of emotional element. And that would affect the way in which paint is applied, the way in which colors are chosen, the way in which the drawing is done. So there is the element of expression. Then there is the element of observation. So right from the mid-70s, as I said, from Irani restaurant, observation became important. That I had to see and note, make sketches. I was not doing so much photography at that time, but later photography, there's various parts of the cities, buildings, overbridge. These two things, the most important is structure. So the structure of the painting, as I mentioned, along with the painting of Yesh, the structure is what gives meaning, essentially, to your observation. Otherwise, you make a lot of observations, you make very detailed drawings, but they become like data. They are like, you can find that data somewhere. So they are not put together into some kind of meaningful structure. An expression can, as in the earliest paintings I showed you, it can become self-indulgent, it can become like sentimental, because then that is all that your emotion, your feeling is all that is important. So there has to be a kind of balance that works out between expression, observation, and structure. And structure is the paramount, which gives meaning to both these observation and to expression. Next, please. Another work from the mid-80s, where observation, I think, becomes very important. And the interaction of multiple lives, multiple characters, and a kind of narrative about city life. So you see this on the left, you see this kind of artist poet figure with his jhola, and he is observing, he's observing the passing of the bus, the scooter, what is happening inside the house. Above, there is a music kind of performance, small music performance in the small room upstairs. All these things brought together through some kind of structure. So observation is brought together through some kind of structure. Next, please. Around this time in the mid-80s, I also became interested in more open spaces. Till now, most of my works were concentrated on street level views, very close up. The people were close up, all the elements were more or less close to me. I was looking at them at the level of the street. Now, it was, in a sense, the landscape, more open spaces, how to work into these, how does the figure and ground work in these in this kind of situation. These are two paintings. So one in which the boy, the figure, is juxtaposed against a receding landscape. The landscape is going back, way back. And the other is this calf which is climbing a hill, so that the background is coming up almost at the level of the figure itself. So here the interaction between the foreground and how do you paint the foreground? In atmospheric perspective, far away hills, far away things, but all of them come to the surface in some way and become integrated in a kind of, and you see that pattern that I've painted there. That is a kind of like you find in a rope bed, caught with a nawar, that is made with a nawar, where you find these crisscrossing of elements. So the perspective used and the way in which various planes interact with each other has that element. So this was the beginning of another phase when I was interested in landscape and the way in which to structure the spaces in landscape. Next, please. To understand this idea of distance and near and distance, I was intrigued by the practices of low relief sculptures in the Renaissance, for example. Low relief is like the thickness of the whole medium is at the most an inch or so, and the distant hills and the foreground kind of molds of mud in the foreground and things like that. The difference between them, thickness difference is hardly there, but that sense. So how does this work? This was another question that I was exploring through terracotta. So the concerns here were mainly about space, how to transfer, how to paint space on a two-dimensional surface. Next, please. This is a painting from 84. Or it's down. So the same concerns move on to larger scale, where a whole townscape unfolds in front of you. Various perspectives are used. It is not like you can see this whole thing from any one point. Various perspectives are added. Various places are brought together within that work. On a wall, the people at the top and the people at the bottom of that wall, they are all painted at eye level and almost of the same size. So it's not like in Western painting or Western mural painting also, where the distance is shown by receding size in the far figure. So all are painted in the same size. Now this has the intended kind of effect that you can enter the painting at any level. Everything is equidistant to you. So you can suddenly, that woman behind the auto rickshaw can be your focus of attention. You might be next to her, or suddenly you might be next to this person carrying his T-square at the bottom of the painting, wherever. So that is another effect of this, the way in which crowds can be organized. Organized, I mean, in a painting. Structured in a painting. Next, please. Another painting of crowds outside the railway station, people going in, coming out, auto rickshaws, cars, various things. Here you can see a more pronounced influence. I can say, of Mexican muralists, Rivera especially. Next, please. This painting is called Riot. As you know, in '92, Mumbai was experienced very severe communal riots. And since then, of the painting, and trying to then bring together the far distance and near distance on this one horizontal plane. Next, please. A little later work this is, 10 years later, from '95 or so. But again, the same element, and I show this to show you the influence of miniatures also, of beautiful design pattern. And this person who's probably been working on the tiles has jumped down or has fallen down from the distant landscape. So this far and near in landscape was of great interest to me. Next, please. I have been influenced by various kinds. As I mentioned leisure, I mentioned Mexican muralists, I've mentioned Indian miniatures, and also to some extent I would say Chinese landscape painters. Mainly the idea in Chinese landscape painting was that the painter sets out on a walk and he goes for a walk on the hills, then he crosses a stream over the bridge, then he turns around another hill, and then he probably comes back to his hut, which is in the foreground. After having this walk, then he sits down to compose that painting. One painting of this walk as such, so that he's not painting what is in front of him. He's painting all that he remembers of seeing on his way. So that in some sense, that was the idea that inspired this kind of painting. It's called Pokhran, which is an area in Thana where I used to go to paint a lot of landscapes in this period. I did a lot of landscapes there. I also showed my work there in schools and factory sheds and various things, because I believe that I was painting in that area and those people needed to see what I was doing. So, but here then you see a figure on the left corner, left bottom, who you can think is now he's starting on his journey, walking up that road. And then the same figure you see up, same in the sense you see another figure right on top of the hill, slightly to the right of the yellow building. And now this landscape on the left part of the landscape is what you would see from this person's perspective. So the light is falling on the landscape. And the right half of the landscape is what you would see from the person up on the hill's perspective. So the light is falling on the opposite direction. So you see bringing different sources of light into the same painting and working this kind of different elements from different places together. It's a kind of a walk that would take about 20-30 minutes, and you go up the hill and then come back on the other side. So you bring all these elements together to make one image of that place. It is not an image where you can see all this from any one point of view, but it's a composite image. Next, please. Before I painted the earlier painting, Pokhran, I was confronted what I was doing. I mentioned that I was painting landscapes in that region. There were small landscapes which I was painting on the spot. I used to take my small canvas box and go and sit there and paint. And then the Pokhran painting, I was thinking, should be a combination of all these different paintings that I had seen. Not paintings actually, but all these different sites that I had seen. So all of them I should be able to incorporate somehow in that large Now, how to do this? There, the idea of the map came to my mind. And I was thinking, there was a place where I had stayed as a child when I was about 10 or 12 years old, the place near Pune. And that was when I was in school, and I remembered that place and various parts of that place almost charted out like a map in my mind. So my own house, where my parents stayed, where I stayed, in the left lower corner, then my friend's house on the right side, then the small path towards my friend's house, then where we used to stand for the school bus, then where we used to go to play football far off in. So all these elements were there as if they had a specific place in that map. Now, there must be some logic how this happens in one's mind. One maps out any place where one lives. One has a certain map, in the sense one has a certain graphic idea of that place. So that was that to explore that, I did this painting by going back to this place where I had stayed as a child. Luckily, the place had not changed because it was an army cantonment, so it had not changed much. And I could re-experience that place, and then I made this painting about. It's called Memory Double Page. And double page, in the sense, it all again refers to the tradition in miniatures, where when they had a larger kind of next piece, when they had a larger theme, they would always paint on double page. I'm just showing these things to show you the influence of miniatures and this kind of thing. Miniatures, I mentioned earlier, of the horizon at the top and the near and the bottom, but there is also another feature in miniatures, how they are built. There is a kind of zigzag perspective that is used, so which is similar to what I am showing in the center of the two paintings. There are two different paintings. One is from Akbarnama, one is from Jahangir Pachanama. But the way in which the landscape and the way in which the structures of the buildings are built, there is a kind of zigzag crossing of them. So that also is something like that Nawar, the structure of the Nawar. So all this concern with structure was in that period, in the period of the 80s. I was very much concerned with how to build paintings, how to build them together, how to bring various things into them, and how to structure them, how to construct them in a sense. Next, please. After having painted people in the earlier part of my, from the 70s onwards, I was painting people, I was painting city life. Then in between, as I showed you, I was involved with landscape and the structure and the technique and things like that of painting. But in the 90s, again, I turned again to painting people's lives. This was an experience personally that we had of flooding in our own house, so that brought that out. But then the 90s were such that there were so many things happening to society, riots and so many other things, that one couldn't have not painted people and people's lives in crisis. So these are from the 90s. I'll also mention here about medium. Right from the first, I used to do a lot of drawing, and I used to use charcoal, pencil or ink and brush drawings, and I used to do oil paintings, canvas. At this particular point, I started to try acrylic. This is acrylic on paper, and I found it very interesting, the way in which I could work with acrylic. And since then, I started to use acrylic, and I was almost exclusively painting in acrylic for the next 20 years or so. So only recently, in the last 5 years, again, when I'm painting now both in acrylic as well as in oils. They have different qualities, though the way in which I handle acrylic is also more or less like in oils. I try to bring the same kind of quality to my acrylic paintings. But they are different in many ways. And I continue to do a lot of drawings in charcoal. Next please. On the same series of floods, rather tragicomic kind of image, what to save when your house is flooded, what are the most important things that you want to save. For us it was very tragic because we lost a lot of my sketchbooks and also books and also camera and things like that. But for this person, obviously the television set is the most important. Next please. And painting crowds. Through the 90s, as again I returned to painting crowds. As this is city again, city street scenes, but where earlier other elements of the street, like the buildings, the columns, this and that, were also very important. They very much part of the composition. While in these paintings, just the crowd of people and the movement, the rhythm in that crowd. I realized that crowds can be very strange in the sense. And I should mention that I very much enjoyed being in a crowd. I very much enjoyed at that period of being in a crowd. Climbing the staircase on a suburban railway station along with a whole lot of people, or entering a train with a whole lot of people. I used to feel like I was part of some larger humanity, So I used to like that. But there is also some very disruptive experiences you can get in a crowd, you can get pushed around. And here I painted a beggar who's kind of somewhat disrupted the flow of people walking, going to work or various things. So painting crowds became an important concern in that period. I should also mention here the influence of Ajanta. Now, Ajanta has a lot of crowd scenes, and the way in which they are painted is very interesting.